The year is 1557. In a modest palace in Brussels, the most powerful man in Europe sits surrounded by ledgers and letters. King Philip II of Spain has just inherited an empire that stretches across 4 continents. Spanish galleons bring mountains of gold and silver from the Americas every year. His armies are feared across Europe. His influence reaches from Manila to Mexico City. And yet, as he signs the document before him, his hand trembles slightly. Because Philip II, ruler of the richest empire on earth, is declaring bankruptcy. How does this happen? How does a nation drowning in gold become unable to pay its bills? And why would this bankruptcy, the first of many, mark the beginning of Spain's long, slow collapse from superpower to secondary nation? The answer lies not in military defeats or political scandals. It lies in something far more invisible, far more devastating. The answer lies in the nature of wealth itself, and what happens when a nation mistakes money for prosperity. If you've ever wondered how empires really fall, stay with me, because what happened to Spain reveals a truth that governments and nations still struggle with today. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes getting exactly what you want can destroy you. Let's go back 50 years to where this story really begins. The year is 1492. Spain has just completed the Reconquista, expelling the last Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula after nearly 8 centuries. The newly unified kingdom of Castile and Aragon is ambitious, powerful, and looking outward. That same year, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, funded by Spanish monarchs, lands in the Caribbean believing he's reached Asia. He hasn't, but what he has found will change everything. Within 30 years, Spanish conquistadors have toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, Hernán Cortés in Mexico, Francisco Pizarro in Peru. And in the mountains of these conquered lands, Spanish soldiers discover something that makes their commanders' hearts race with greed: silver. Enormous deposits of it, more silver than exists in all of Europe combined. The most famous is Potosí in modern-day Bolivia. When the Spanish discover the mountain of silver there in 1545, they call it Cerro Rico, the rich hill. And for the next century, Potosí will produce more silver than anywhere else on earth. Indigenous laborers, forced into brutal conditions through a system called the maita, dig the ore from deep shafts. They die by the tens of thousands from accidents, exhaustion, and mercury poisoning used in processing the silver. But the silver keeps flowing. By the 1560s, Spanish treasure fleets, the famous Manila galleons and Flota de Indias, are crossing the Atlantic loaded with millions of pesos worth of precious metal. The convoy system is heavily armed. Dozens of ships sailing together, protected by warships, carrying what would be billions of dollars in today's money. When these fleets arrive in Seville, the Spanish crown takes its royal fifth, 20% of all the treasure. The rest flows into the Spanish economy. Gold and silver coins flood the markets. Spain is rich, richer than it has ever been, richer than any European nation has ever been. And this, incredibly, is where the problem begins. Here's the question most people never ask. What is money really? Money is not wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. It's a tool for exchanging goods and services. A farmer grows wheat. A blacksmith makes tools. Money allows them to trade without bartering. But money itself is not food, not tools, not clothing. It's just the medium of exchange. So what happens when one nation suddenly has vastly more money than its neighbors, but isn't producing more actual goods? At first it feels like paradise. Spanish nobles suddenly have chests full of silver coins. They want fine clothing, so they buy Flemish textiles. They want furniture, so they import Italian craftsmanship. They want spices and luxuries, so merchants bring goods from across Europe. Spanish cities boom, construction explodes. The court in Madrid becomes legendary for its opulence. But here's the catch. Spain is buying more than it's selling. The silver that flows into Spain doesn't stay there. It flows right back out to pay for imports. And because Spain now has so much money chasing the same amount of goods, something inevitable happens. Prices start rising. This is inflation. And in 16th century Spain, it's catastrophic. Imagine you're a Spanish shoemaker in 1550. Last year, you could buy a week's worth of food for 2 silver reals. This year, that same food costs 3 reals. Next year, it might cost 4. Your costs are rising, but you can't raise prices fast enough because foreign competitors who don't have inflation can undercut you. So you do what makes sense. You stop making shoes. Why struggle with rising costs and thin margins when you can simply import cheaper shoes from France or the Netherlands? Across Spain, the same calculation happens in industry after industry. Textile production, metalworking, shipbuilding, manufacturing. Spanish production collapses. The economy becomes dependent on imports, and all of this is paid for by that endless stream of silver from the Americas. But here's the cruel irony, the thing that makes this story so darkly fascinating. The more silver arrives, the worse the problem gets. Each treasure fleet brings more inflation. Each wave of inflation makes Spanish goods less competitive. Each loss of competitiveness makes Spain more dependent on imports. Each import requires more silver to leave the country. Spain is trapped in what economists would later call the resource curse. The treasure that should have built an empire is instead hollowing it out from within. Now, you might be wondering, didn't anyone notice? Didn't Spanish rulers see what was happening? They did. But they faced a different problem. War. Spain in the 16th century is constantly fighting. Wars against France, wars against the Ottoman Empire, wars against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, wars against England. The famous Spanish Armada of 1588, that massive fleet sent to invade. England cost a fortune even before it's destroyed by storms and English ships. And here's where we need to understand how 16th century warfare worked. Kings didn't maintain large standing armies. Instead, they hired mercenaries. German Landsknechts, Swiss pikemen, Italian cavalry. These professional soldiers fought for whoever paid them, and they demanded payment in silver on time, every time. Miss a payment and your army might mutiny. Or worse, switch sides. So Spanish kings, Charles V and then his son Philip II, need constant, enormous amounts of silver just to keep their armies in the field. They need it to pay soldiers, to buy gunpowder, to construct fortifications, to fund their diplomatic networks across Europe. But here's the problem. The silver arrives irregularly. Treasure fleets take months to cross the Atlantic. Ships sink in storms. Pirates like Francis Drake raid the convoys. And even when the silver arrives safely, the royal fifth isn't always enough to cover expenses. So what does Spain do? It borrows. The Spanish crown turns to Europe's bankers, mostly based in Genoa, Augsburg, and later Amsterdam. These bankers are willing to lend enormous sums to the Spanish king. After all, he has collateral, those future treasure fleets. The king promises to repay loans with silver that hasn't arrived yet. Sometimes he pledges the revenue from entire fleets years in advance. This is where the system becomes truly dangerous. Spain isn't just spending its current wealth, it's spending wealth it expects to receive in the future. Every loan must be repaid with interest, and interest, in the 16th century, typically ranges from 10 to 15% annually. Some emergency loans carry rates as high as 40%. Can you see where this leads? Let's trace the math of empire collapse. The king borrows 1 million ducats to fund a campaign in the Netherlands. He promises to repay it with 12% interest when the next treasure fleet arrives. But when that fleet arrives, he's already spent the money on another campaign, so he takes out a new loan to repay the old one, and another to fund the ongoing war, and another. This is called refinancing debt, and it works until it doesn't. By the 1550s, the Spanish crown is spending more on interest payments than on anything else except military expenses. In some years, over 60% of the silver arriving from the Americas goes directly to bankers before the king can use it for anything else. The treasure fleets that were supposed to make Spain the richest nation on earth are instead servicing debts to foreign creditors. And still, the wars continue. Spain is fighting Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, a conflict that will drag on for 80 years. It's fighting France for control of Italy. It's maintaining military presences across an empire where, as they say, the sun never sets. All of this requires money, more money than even Potosí can provide. In 1557, King Philip II does the unthinkable. He suspends all debt payments. This is the bankruptcy we mentioned at the beginning. But it's not like a modern bankruptcy where assets are liquidated. Instead, Philip essentially forces his creditors to accept new terms, lower interest rates, longer repayment periods, and conversion of short-term debt into long-term bonds. The bankers are furious, but what can they do? Default to the most powerful military force in Europe? They accept the terms, but trust is shattered. From now on, lending to Spain becomes riskier, interest rates increase, credit becomes harder to obtain, and Spain becomes even more dependent on that silver arriving from the Americas, silver that is already pledged to previous debts. Spain will declare bankruptcy again in 1575, and again in 1596, and again in 1607, 1627, and 1647. Each time the pattern is the same: borrow, spend, promise future treasure, fail to pay, force creditors to renegotiate, repeat. By the mid-17th century, Spain's credit is so damaged that even desperate loans carry crushing interest rates. The empire is locked in a death spiral of debt, inflation, and declining production. Meanwhile, something crucial is happening in Northern Europe, something Spain is too distracted to notice until it's too late. The Netherlands, ironically a Spanish possession in revolt, is becoming an economic powerhouse, not through silver mines, but through manufacturing, trade, and finance. Dutch merchants build efficient ships. Dutch workshops produce high-quality textiles and manufactured goods. Dutch banks develop sophisticated financial instruments. England follows a similar path. Instead of chasing gold, English policy focuses on building industries, protecting domestic manufacturers with tariffs, investing in naval power to protect trade routes, creating institutions like the Bank of England to manage government finances. And here's the devastating comparison. By the 1600s, the Dutch and English are producing wealth. Spain is extracting wealth. Production creates sustainable prosperity. Extraction creates dependency. When Spanish silver production begins declining in the mid-17th century, as the easiest ore deposits are exhausted and deeper mining becomes less profitable, Spain has nothing to fall back on. Its manufacturing base is gone. Its merchants can't compete. Its government is drowning in debt. The empire that controlled half the known world is becoming irrelevant. Let's talk about what this means. Because the fall of Spain isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a lesson about the nature of power itself. Spain made a simple mistake. It confused money with wealth. It believed that controlling gold and silver was the same as controlling prosperity. But real wealth comes from production, from the ability to create goods and services that others want, from industries, skills, infrastructure, and innovation. Spain also fell victim to what we might call the paradox of abundance. When you have easy access to resources, you don't develop the institutions and habits necessary for sustainable growth. Why invest in difficult, slow manufacturing when you can simply buy what you need with silver? Why reform your economy when treasure fleets keep arriving? But easy money makes you vulnerable. It makes you lazy. It prevents you from building the deeper foundations of national strength. By the time Spain realized this, it was too late. The industries were gone. The skilled workers had emigrated. The capital had been spent. And the rivals who had built their power on production rather than extraction had become unstoppable. By 1700, when the Spanish Habsburg line ends and the War of Spanish Succession begins, Spain is a secondary power fighting over scraps. The empire still exists on paper, vast territories in the Americas, the Philippines, but real power has shifted north, to Amsterdam, to London, to Paris. The nation that once bestrode the world like a colossus has become an afterthought in European politics. There's a deeper story here too, a human story. Think about the millions of indigenous people who died in the mines of Potosí and Zacatecas. Their labor extracted the silver that was supposed to build Spanish glory. Instead, that silver flowed through Spain like water through a sieve, enriching European bankers and foreign merchants while leaving Spain itself impoverished. The treasure didn't create lasting prosperity in the Americas either. Colonial economies were structured around extraction, mining, plantation agriculture, rather than diversified development. When independence came in the 19th century, these nations inherited economies distorted by centuries of colonial exploitation. The gold and silver that were supposed to create wealth instead created dependencies, distortions, and ultimately decline for everyone involved, except the middlemen, the bankers and merchants who facilitated the flow of treasure across Europe. So what's the lesson here? What does 16th century Spain teach us about economics, power, and history? First, that wealth is not the same as money. Having resources is meaningless if you don't have the institutions, industries, and capabilities to transform them into sustainable prosperity. Second, that easy money corrupts. When wealth comes without effort, it prevents the development of the skills and structures necessary for long-term success. Third, that debt is a trap. Borrowing against future wealth works only if that wealth continues growing. When it doesn't, the compounding interest becomes an anchor dragging you down. And finally, that empires fall, not with dramatic explosions, but with slow hollowing out. Spain didn't collapse in a day. It declined over generations, each year slightly weaker, slightly poorer, slightly less relevant, until one day everyone looked around and realized the superpower was gone. This is how power really ends, not with conquest or catastrophe, but with accumulated choices, with small decisions that seem reasonable at the time but compound into structural weakness, with the slow replacement of production with consumption, investment with debt, substance with appearance. Spain's story is a warning about the seductive danger of easy wealth, about the difference between power and prosperity, about how quickly dominance can become dependence. The Spanish Empire lasted for centuries after its economic peak. Its formal end didn't come until the 19th century. But the real empire, the dynamic, confident, world-shaping force, died much earlier. It died in those bankruptcy declarations, in those treasure fleets sailing past a decaying industrial base, in those decisions to buy rather than build, to borrow rather than reform, to consume rather than create. And perhaps that's the most sobering lesson of all, that you can win everything you wanted and still lose everything that matters. That gold can glitter brightly even as it poisons the soil beneath your feet. That sometimes the greatest curse is having your wishes granted. Spain wished for treasure, and it got exactly that, and it was destroyed by it.